So, good afternoon. Welcome on behalf of the Bloomington Bach Cantata Project. I'm Dan Willamette, Director. We're glad to see you here on such a beautiful day and so soon after we gathered last time to hear Cantata 9. We present cantatas by Johann Sebastian Bach in performances modeled on his own, based on what the sources and research has told us about how he presented these pieces to his congregations in the years in which he worked mostly in Weimar and in Leipzig. We are supported by the generous donations of our supporters. If their names and an expression of our gratitude you will find in your program. We hope that if you were not already on that list, you will consider joining us. Information on how to donate is in the program. There's a basket outside. There's a QR code link to our donation page outside. We make it easy, but that's partly because those of you who donate make it possible, even easy, for us to put on these productions. Our routine is to hear a performance of today's cantata, a short talk about it, and then a second performance in which we hope you will hear new and different things. Today we are particularly honored to welcome a guest, Geoffrey Burgess, oboe, who is here visiting the Historical Performance Institute under the Five Friends program, and we are honored to have him here, especially for a cantata and a cantata chosen, in which oboe plays a really important role. So welcome once again, glad to see you all here.
Mit meinen Händen, so wirst du auch auf mich dein gnädig Auge wenden. Willst du mich meine Sünden wegen ins Krankenbette legen? Mein Gott, so bitt ich dich, lass deine Güte größer sein als die Gerechtigkeit. Doch hast du mich dazu versehen, dass mich mein Leiden soll verzehren. Ich bin bereit, dein Wille soll an mir geschehen, verschonne nicht und fahre fort, lass meine Not nicht lange währen. Je länger hier, je später dort. von Herzen danken. Doch aber gib mir auch dabei, dass auch in meinem frischen Leibe die Seele Sondenkrankheit sei und alle Zeit gesund verbleibe. Nimm sie durch Geist und Wort in Acht, denn dieses ist meine Heil. Und wenn mir Leib und Seele verschmacht, so bist du Gott mein Trost und meines Herzens Teil.
Good afternoon once again. The text of today's work is by Christian Friedrich Henrici, who was Bach's frequent collaborator in Leipzig. He was a poet who lived in that city, and he used the pen name Picander. That's a typical classicizing reference, a vague one, not a specific one. But so many of the learned poets of the time fancied themselves to be heirs of the classical poet tradition and gave themselves pen names that sounded it. This work that we've heard is for the third Sunday after Epiphany, so from around the 21st to the 27th of January, depending on how the days of the week fell. And it was from a complete annual cycle of cantata texts by Picander that he published in the year 1728. Now, for a long time, this collection, this cycle of church cantatas was known only from a reprint in 1732, one of a series of volumes that Picander issued with poetry of various kinds in it. But a copy of the original 1728 print was discovered just a few years ago in a library in St. Petersburg, in fact, in Russia. Now, Bach is known to have set approximately 9 texts, 9 pieces, 9 cantatas from that cycle. There's a couple of more settings by students that are known, one by Carl Philipp Emanuel Bach, his second eldest son, but also his student in composition, and by Johann Friedrich Dolus, who ended up being his second successor as Leipzig Thomas Cantor. It's never been entirely clear whether Bach set the entire cycle of cantatas by Picander to music. Picander's preface has an interesting statement in it. Picander flatters himself, this is for a little address to the reader at the beginning, the author flatters himself that perhaps the deficiencies of poetic charm in these works might be offset by the beauty of the incomparable Kapellmeister Bach, and that these songs might sound in Leipzig's principal churches. Now, it's never been clear whether this was just formulaic self-deprecation, saying he's hoping that their weaknesses to which he's sort of obligated to refer might be made up for by Bach's settings, meaning Bach set all of them to music, or he was expressing the hope that Bach would set them to music. And it makes a big difference if you're interested in whether Bach actually composed all these or not. So we've got something like 9 pieces, and now these 2 by students, And I think there's actually bits and pieces of traces that maybe Bach assigned these to other students as well. It's not entirely clear. It seems unlikely to me from where we sit that Bach did compose all of them. And it's not even clear whether he set them all at once, in one stretch in one liturgical year when he did, or perhaps over a few years, drawing on them now and then. We don't know when Bach composed BWV 156, today's piece in particular. And we don't know that because no original sources survived. The earliest source is a set of parts from the second half of the 18th century from the Leipzig Thomasschule. So it looks as if these were parts that were used in the liturgy in Leipzig, in St. Thomas and St. Nicholas Church, so the same by some successor of J.S. Bach, but they are too young, they're too young to have been produced under J.S. Bach directly. The circumstances point to the reliability of the attribution of this piece to Bach, its Leipzig transmission, as I just told you, the use of a concerto movement known to be by Johann Sebastian Bach as its opening Sinfonia, and the appearance of its final chorale in several of these collections of four-part chorales by J.S. Bach that circulated among students and then were eventually published, first by Bernstein and then by Breitkopf. And so there's enough pointers to there being Bach music in this piece to think that this is a J.S. Bach piece. The liturgical date tells us what time of year it was for, the third Sunday after Epiphany, and the 1728 publication date of the texts and the date of approximate date anyway of the other Bach settings of the cantos and librettos point to a composition and first performance sometime in the late 1720s. 1729, as early as 1727, we don't know for sure. Now, the lack of original sources for this piece means that there are some other things we don't know about it. Some questions of scoring, both vocal and instrumental. The first aria, the first movement after the Sinfonia, is frankly a mess in the sources. Those Leipzig parts, which I'll remind you again date from after Bach time, say that this is an alto aria, and in fact it is copied into the alto part, but notated as though it were a tenor line, as if there were a tenor clef sitting there and it was actually a tenor pitch. You can't read it in alto clef and have it make any musical sense. It says it's an alto aria, but it's also copied into the bass part with a bass clef, but notated the wrong pitch there too. It doesn't make sense in the bass clef and it doesn't make sense in the alto clef. It's pretty clear that both these versions were copied from some source that notated it for tenor, in the tenor clef, and that the copyist screwed it up both times, putting it in the alto part and in the bass clef. But at least that sort of doubles our evidence that this was an aria, one of whose two vocal lines was for tenor. Its range is clearly for tenor as opposed to any of the other voices. And it yields a tenor aria with soprano chorale, an alto aria, and two bass recits. So SATB are all accounted for in the soloistic movements, which is extremely common, as we've heard here again and again among the Bach pieces. So I think we can be pretty sure that this is indeed a tenor aria, despite what I will call again a mess in the one source we have from Leipzig. The instrumental scoring has some unknowns too. The second aria that we heard has two obligato instruments in it. One is pretty clearly for oboe, and the other is for violin. But that set of Leipzig parts puts that violin line in both the violin 1 part and the violin 2 part. That is a kind of orchestral violin texture with solo oboe. And that doesn't look or sound right for Bach's practice for this kind of piece, in which those two obligato lines are so closely matched in their musical material. When there are two equal lines in an aria, Bach tended to call for oboe, solo almost by definition, and solo violin, and that seems more likely, and it's what we've done here. There are other things that need to be filled in as well, but they're more obvious given what we know about Bach's usual practice. We assume that there were usual two players on each of the two violin ones, so two people playing violin 1, two people playing violin 2. The typical basso continuo complement that we heard here of cello, violone, and organ. Those were Bach's typical Leipzig church performing forces, and there's every reason to think that they applied here. And then the final chorale certainly used Bach's usual instrumental doubling, violin 1, violin 2, and viola on soprano, alto, tenor. They just double the vocal lines of that chorale. Basso continuo on the bass line, and then the one woodwind instrument here, oboe, playing the soprano melody as well. That, again, is so standard. There's just no questions here about how Bach typically did these things. So we can be pretty sure that we can come quite close to how this piece would have been heard, even in the absence of sources that come directly from J.S. Bach. So what is this piece about and why? It's more or less obvious from this very evocative title, right? I stand with one foot in the grave. But there's a particular Lutheran emphasis here that helps explain some features of the text and music and suggests that this piece isn't quite what it seems so obviously to be about. So in the gospel reading for that day, the third Sunday after Epiphany, there are two stories of Jesus miraculously healing people. He heals a leper, and then he heals the servant of a certain captain. Now, the idea of illness is an obvious theme in the libretto. In movement 2, that first aria, we hear about the sick body, and we hear, of course, about the grave. In the movement number 3, we hear about the sick bed, and we hear about suffering, presumably from illness. But the main theological concern in this cantata is not illness or even death. The topic of this piece is pointed to in a few phrases. In the first vocal movement, in movement number 2, when it pleases you, addressing God, and take it, Lord, into your hands. And in the third movement, my life and death stand, dear God, in your hands. And the really key line happens near the end of the recitative, number 3, Dein Wille soll an mir geschehen, your will shall be done upon me. The important word here is Wille, will. And the rest of the cantata centers on it. Movement 4, Herr, was du willst, soll mir gefallen. Lord, what you will, may that please me. And then at the end, Herr, wie du willst, Lord, as you wish. Movement 5, und willst du, dass ich nicht soll kranken? And if you wish, if you will it, that I should not become sick. And then movement 6, the chorale, Herr, wie du willst, Lord, as you will. Sonst wie du willst, as you will. And then in its last line, Dein Wille, das ist der Beste. Your will, it is the best. The will here, God's will is what's important. And in case you wanted to know what Bach's cantatas, other cantatas for this same feast were, the third Sunday after Epiphany, BWV 73 opens Herr, wie du willst, so schick's mit mir. BWV 111, was mein Gott will, das geschehe allzeit. And BWV 72, alles nur nach Gottes Wille. And I don't think I even need to translate any of these for those of you who don't speak German. This idea of God's will comes as expected from the gospel reading. Herr, so du willst, kann du mich wohl reinigen. Lord, if you will it, says the leper, you can indeed heal or purify me. And Jesus responds, Ich will's tun, so sei gereinigt. I will do it, I will do so. Be healed, be purified. And then when he's asked to heal the servant of the captain, his response is, Ich will kommen und ihn gesund machen, I will come. So this idea of will is there, especially in that first request, Herr, so du willst, kannst du mich wohl reinigen. Lord, if you will it, you can indeed purify me. Now Bach makes this emphasis particularly clear in the aria number 4. This opening textual phrase, Herr, was du willst, sung Herr, was du willst, Herr, was du willst, is of course repeated frequently in the voice. And that same idea, more or less predictably, opens the ritornello, not just once, but in successive measures by the oboe and then violin solo, in imitation of them. And the basso continuo line is made up largely of this idea, dum bum bum bum, dim bum bum bum, or sometimes in chain, dim be da dum bim ba da dum bim ba da da, again and again and again. The listener quickly comes to associate that musical idea with the text, Herr, was du willst, even in its instrumental presentations. And so that aria number 4 is absolutely saturated with that phrase, sometimes sung vocally and sometimes sung, if you will, instrumentally. It's worth probably noting a theological concern. I guess I can't get through these without noting theological concerns, but I'll give you one. The commentary on this material by Luther and on his followers are at pains to make a very particular point about this line, about this words, Lord, if you will it, you can purify me. It's not an expression of doubt, says Luther, of whether God will or won't wish to heal or show goodwill to the person. You can take that for granted, he says. Rather, What's important here is for the believer to understand that the believer can't know whether what faith asks for, here's what I wish, maybe you will, is actually good for the believer or not. Only God knows whether what you ask for is good for you, and that determines whether God will do these things on behalf of the believer or not. And that helps explain the language of the first three movements of this cantata. It expresses acceptance of health, or of sickness, or of life, or of death, or of suffering in body, or suffering of soul. It'll accept all those things in the words of the voices of the cantata, because any of those might well be God's will. However much suffering might be involved in them, they are all for the believer's benefit, and the believer has to accept any of them. And so this talk in the beginning is not so much about I am prepared to die, as I am prepared to accept God's will, whatever it might be. And that's the connection between the way this text opens and then this emphasis on was du wird runs all the way through it. Now, one of the things you learn in doing performances this way, as you heard it, with the forces that Bach used, is that the relationship of voices and instruments to each other is really complex. It's not two sets of forces. We don't treat them that way. We don't rehearse them that way. We don't pay them that way. But there's nothing we do that treats the voices and instruments differently here. You need to hear them as they're better heard as a unified ensemble, not, say, instruments that accompany the voices. As important as the text is, that's not what these pieces are about. This is perfectly illustrated in some things you can listen for in this very cantata. Things that show Bach using the musical language of his time to blur the role and overlap the role of voices and instruments. So take the opening Sinfonia, for example. It's a concerto slow movement. Literally, in fact, it shows up as a slow movement of BWV 1056. But it's really a vocal aria played on the oboe with strings accompanying. It's got a statement of a melodic idea in regular phrases. It's got a departure from that, and then it's got a return to it, a very familiar ABA sort of song form. The type here, the early 18th century type, is the same one reflected on the piece by Bach known as the air on the G string from the orchestral suite BWV 1068, right? With a violin line, a melodic line, and a slow-moving, regularly pulsing accompaniment. If you want a parallel closer to our time, it's the very type referred to in Procol Harum's Whiter Shaded Pale. Right? It's that very kind of piece. Can't resist. In the first, so you can listen to that opening Sinfonia, which you will actually find published as a solo, independent solo piece for modern players to play, and you'll find recordings calling it arioso, which doesn't actually say in any of the original sources, but it's precisely right. It's a little aria. So you have an instrument acting like a voice in that opening movement. And like a voice singing a beautiful melody like that Bach writes out in a fairly simple form, it would be entirely appropriate for a singer to ornament that melody, to fill in gaps, to do things with it. I don't think we can count on Geoffrey Burgess playing that piece in our second performance precisely the way he played it the first time. It's just not in the nature of this beautiful cantilena arioso. Okay, I'll give in. I'll use the word that opens the piece. An instrument acting like a voice. In number two, the first aria, of course, this piece actually has two texts. One is the new poem. That's what makes it an aria. An aria, setting of a piece of new poetry, and a chorale stanza, and they're meant to be heard in textual relationship to each other. The musical organization of this movement is actually based around the chorale and its musical logic and how its phrases unfold, not the aria text and the tenor line. Now, the tenor starts out as though it's the one that's being sort of opposed to the ritornello. You get the full instrumental ritornello, which makes a cadence, and then the voice, the tenor voice, enters. And it sounds as if, oh, this is one of these pieces in which ritornellos are going to frame a tenor aria, which will have vocal periods. But the tenor actually ends up working with the instruments in this movement. And the tenor, solo vocal tenor, and the instruments are actually working together to frame the statements of the chorale sung by the soprano. And the balance might strike you as a little strange. It's one of these really beautiful Bach obbligato lines in which he asks for all five upper strings, all four violins and viola to play in unison. And you might say, oh, that has the potential to drown out the tenor, but the tenor isn't actually the focus of this, as beautiful as the tenor line is. It's those upper strings and the tenor framing the soprano chorale line. That's the musical organization. Now, the textual organization points to it being a tenor aria, and as a type, it is a tenor aria because its principal text and its opening text and its closing text are the poetic text. But when a composer like Bach drops an existing chorale tune into an aria, the chorale tune has a given melody, it has a given harmonic organization, and that's what ends up governing the piece. That's what ends up determining what the composer pretty much has to do to make the piece work out. The tenor and the violins can't just go off and do what they want and hope that the phrases of the chorale will sort of fit there. That's not how this works. Right? So you have the voice, the tenor voice in this piece, essentially acting like an instrument in this. And in the second aria, you have a ritornello with two instruments, and as I mentioned before, and as you heard, those two instruments, oboe and solo violin, have successive entrances in imitation of each other, and their lines interact with the piece. When the voice enters, the voice takes on one of those two roles. So it's one of the instruments and the voice interacting with each other, where before you had an instrument and an instrument. The voice is now in imitation with the instrument. In other words, at this point, the voice is acting like an instrument. And we've seen the implied instrumental statements of Herr, was du willst, as if the instruments were singing text. You have instruments acting like a voice. So all through this piece, you can listen for how Bach is reminding you and us that this is a unified musical ensemble. He has voices acting like instruments and instruments acting like voices. And then, of course, in the final chorale, what the voices sing is precisely what the instruments play. This is a unified statement at the end of something that is equally vocal and instrumental. Thank you.
Mein Leben und mein Tod steht, liebster Gott, in deinen Händen. So wirst du auch auf mich dein gnädig Auge wenden. Willst du mich meine Sünden wegen ins Krankenbette legen? Mein Gott, so bitt ich dich, lass deine Güte größer sein als die Gerechtigkeit. Doch hast du mich dazu versehen, dass mich mein Leiden soll verzehren. Ich bin bereit, dein Wille soll an mir geschehen, verschone nicht und fahre fort. Lass meine Not nicht lange währen, je länger hier, je schwerer voll Kranken, so werd ich dir von Herzen danken. Doch aber gib mir auch dabei, dass auch in meinem frischen Leibe die Seele Sonderkrankheit sei und alle Zeit gesund verbleibe. Nimm sie durch Geist und Wort in Acht, denn dieses ist mein Heil. Und wenn mir Leib und Seel verschmacht, so bist du Gott mein Trost.